Hello again.
Hey, we're going to move right along so to keep us on schedule. Our panel now is dedicated to the issue of constructing the future of UN peace operations. And I think it's only appropriate for any conference being held in Canada to recall the seminal role that Canadian illustrated, illustrious Canadian of the past, thinking specifically of Lester Pearson, played in launching um, UN peace operations. And that is a legacy that I hope we can live up to going forward. We are honored to have two, I would say, of the most veteran Canadians involved in UN peace operations, really chevronné for decades of engagement in trying to make those operations more effective. I won't go over all of their backgrounds. They're there in the program, but just again to say how delighted I am to have colleagues Peggy Mason and Walter Dorn here to speak to this issue. I would just, in terms of some context, note that at the UN Summit of the Future held last month, and in the outcome document from that gathering called the Pact for the Future, there is a whole Action 21 dedicated to peace operations. And I would just note in that context that, and to quote the sort of chapeau of that, is know that peace operations can only succeed when political solutions are actively pursued and they have predictable, adequate, and sustained financing. And it goes on to call upon the Security Councils to ensure that peace operations are anchored in and guided by political strategies, deployed with clear sequence and prioritized mandates that are realistic and achievable, exit strategies and viable transition plans, and as part of a comprehensive approach to sustaining peace in full compliance with international law and the UN Charter. So it's a high bar, I think, of expectations, be fair to say. So I'm curious to hear what our colleagues have in terms of their own reflections on this. And I understand Peggy will go first in comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. And it's a pleasure to be here with Walter and I have been on panels on this before, but not in the very recent past. And I note in the short bio, I didn't actually, I'll just make this one additional point because it's not in there. And that was, I had the great privilege between 1995 and 2012 to be an external faculty member of the Pearson Peacekeeping Center, a truly fantastic Canadian institution, which was allowed to atrophy and die. And also during that time, I did some work for what was called then the Lessons Learned Unit of what was then called the Department of Peace, the DPKO, Peacekeeping Operations, now the Department of Peace Operations, on aspects of peace operations. So I guess what I want, if I was going to nutshell say my overall message, UN peace operations are indispensable tools for helping resolve conflict, but they've run into trouble due to the increasing complexity of conflict and the Security Council mandates straying from some of the hard learned lessons and the fundamentals of UN peacekeeping. But, Paul alluded to that in his introduction, I mean, solutions are, there's been a lot of effort. There's been a lot of high-level panels and studies. There are a lot of non-governmental academic organizations also engaged in trying to help UN peace operations adapt. And obviously, Canada can play a role in that. But as the broken record of both Walter and I will say, not unless the precondition for that is re-engaging fully in UN peacekeeping. And that's not just a message for the Department of National Defense. How many here know that the lead department on UN peace operations, precisely because of the primacy of the peace process, is GAC, Global Affairs, and they need to make it a priority. Okay. And the other thing I'd say at the outset to kind of demonstrate really the strength of UN peace operations is that despite the paralysis in the UN Security Council on so many issues, due to the Ukraine conflict and other serious P5 disagreements. And nonetheless, UN peacekeeping mandates have been renewed with even a new mission, police mission in Haiti created, although we could probably have a whole discussion on the problems there with the biggest one being the lack of a political plan for the mission. Overarching credible political plan. This is not to say that divisions among the P5 are not hampering operations. And they're certainly hampering the kind of support, unified support from the Security Council that is generally needed for complex operations to succeed. But the fact that they are cooperating at all on this, the fact that they're renewing mandates and they're even creating, as I said, the new mission, this is surely a testament to the value they see in UN peace operations, the value of this instrument for international peace and security. I just want to step back now, though, having said that, just a very quick primer to remind ourselves on why UN peace operations are so unique and so important and cannot be replaced. There is no other such mechanism. Peace building is a complex long-term process of helping the conflicting parties to create the necessary conditions, political, economic security for sustainable peace. At the center of this effort is a peace process. Complex political problems lie at the heart of violent conflict and require political solutions negotiated and agreed to by the parties. A robust security element may be essential in both the negotiation and implementation phases, but it is a supporting element nonetheless. As the Afghanistan debacle has so dramatically and tragically illustrated, no amount of military robustness and professionalism on the part of international military forces can make up for the lack of a credible peace process. And there is a lot of empirical evidence on how useless the resort to military force really is when it comes to ending violent conflict. As Ernie Regier, who is here today and who was celebrated yesterday with his distinguished leadership on nuclear disarmament questions, as he demonstrated in his 2015 book, Disarming Conflict, Why Peace Cannot Be Won on the Battlefield, he has demonstrated, the statistics show that once started, the overwhelming majority of wars, 85% in the past 25 years, cannot be settled on the battlefield. Instead, most are fought to hurting stalemates. The wars of the past quarter century have been singularly incapable of driving constructive political outcomes that overcome the conditions and conflicts that led to the war in the first place. And that was 2015, the book, but the evidence since then of the paramount role of negotiated settlements and bringing conflicts to an end and reaching a sustainable peace, that has become even more tangible given the fact that since his book was written, the surge in the number of armed conflicts has reversed the 20-year decline. And those figures and do not include Ukraine and Gaza. So with the primacy of the peace process in mind, starting in the late 90s, international peacekeeping operations, international multi-dimensional UN peacekeeping operations were called upon not only to keep the peace, but to facilitate the political process and support the establishment of legitimate and effective institutions of governance. For a collective enterprise of this magnitude to succeed, the international effort must be perceived as legitimate and impartial by all or most of the parties to the conflict. And it must have the broadest possible international support within a coherent legal and operational framework. Only the UN Security Council can mandate such an operation, and only the UN organization can even notionally lead it, if only because there is simply no other single entity acceptable to the entire community. But actually beyond that, given the coordination capacity and the institutional backstop capacity required, the UN organization is even the only one, not just notionally, but practically, that can do it. Headed by a civilian in the role of the special representative of the UN Secretary General, with all the other components, including the military and the police, reporting to him or her, the very structure of a UN peacekeeping operation reflects the centrality of the peace process. This stands in sharp contrast to NATO-led missions, which is why I'm making this point. NATO is not an alternative to this. It does not have the political element in its missions. They're military missions. So the structure of a UN peacekeeping mission headed by a civilian stands in sharp contrast to NATO-led missions authorized by the UN Security Council to assist in stabilizing a conflict where the military mission is completely separate from the UN mission. How can the military effectively support the peace process under a separate command? I could say more on that. I guess the one thing I'll say is my 10 years of training experience of training exercises with senior NATO commanders preparing for their deployments to Afghanistan, Bosnia, or Kosovo demonstrated to me again and again that a divided command structure at the operational level between the political and the military is a recipe for an ineffective command structure. Okay, so to recap, the main comparative advantages for UN peace operations are its integrated command structure under civilian authority, which reflects the primacy of the peace process and which facilitates a unity of purpose among all of the actors. The fact that the UN organization is the only organization through which the forces of the P5, China's a big UN peacekeeping contributor now, and all major powers, including the rising and regional powers, can jointly participate. And the full range of UN institutional support, coordination capacity, and security assistance can only be triggered by the UN Security Council authorization of a UN multidimensional mission. Okay, now very, very briefly to the problems. Walter is going to elaborate further on possibly some of the solutions. However, this structure, the UN peacekeeping operations, expert level studies, high level reviews, as I said, this has been subject of ongoing effort and study, have identified two key problems for UN missions. The first one is the Security Council's failure to support the primacy of politics, the centrality of the peace process, what a former UN Secretary General has called the preeminent UN role in facilitating conflict resolution. And jumping ahead, so glad that Paul read out at the outset that one statement from the UN Pact for the Future agreed to by all of the leaders at summit level at the UN General Assembly. The one thing that they focused on was the preeminent role of UN peacekeeping operations in facilitating the peace process. So hopefully that means we'll get back on track there. So the two problems arisen. One, the Security Council's failure, which means that the mandates were often not giving the UN mission the primary role in facilitating the peace process. Often the UN was sidelined and there were other actors without frankly the capacity, and often with agendas that directly undermined their ability to carry out this central function. And so I can come back to more on that later, but what am I doing? How am I doing for time?
If you could, about 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay, well, I might be able to do it in 2 minutes. Okay. The second problem is the terrible strain that has been put on the core principles of UN peace operations, which underpin all of their work, and that is consent of the parties, at least at the strategic level, to the mission, impartiality of the mission, and the limited use of force to the extent possible. The increasing complexity of conflicts over the past decade, with the tripling of major civil wars driven by the growing role of non-state actors, the greater impact of violent extremism, and the influence of transnational crime networks has put a huge strain on peace operations. It has led UN peacekeepers increasingly to be deployed in the absence of viable peace processes, and it has also led to the UN mission being deployed alongside anti-terrorist missions. And that has created the broader issue of terrorist lists, has created a tremendous problem for the UN if the name of the game is to negotiate a peace settlement and the higher level de facto rules out a whole series of actors that can't be negotiated with. You're undermining the fundamentals. And that's, of course, what's happened in Mali. And now the military junta, having thrown out the UN mission, is now discovering that it might not be a bad idea to start negotiating with some of the groups that they had declared they were going to get rid of. Okay, so those are problems. Those are two huge problems. But as I said, the pact, at least, and the final one, which no doubt Rolf will talk about, of course, is resources, and that means Western nations, not just Canada, fully re-engaging. But as Paul has noted, the pact has at least zeroed in on the issue that the Security Council has got to start making sure that the mandates put the peace process at the center. But the other important thing that the pact does is that it calls on the Secretary General to do a review of UN peace operations. And that is very important because the other key document here goes far further, much more detail, is the Secretary General's a new agenda for peace. And there he has a lot more to say about UN peace operations. It's taken note of in the pact, which is better than silence and being dismissed. But the request for the UN Secretary General to carry out this study in light of what he has written, in my view, it's a green light for him to go ahead and try and build consensus around what he's got in the agenda for peace. The final point I'll say is I hope that somebody asks me about an example that I would like to give of a UN transitional administration in Palestine as the way forward for a viable two-state solution in Palestine. So maybe that'll pique someone's interest. Thank you all very, very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I feel very much at home here at the University of Ottawa in Pugwash. I was intellectually born to these issues in the peace movement and through Science for Peace in Pugwash. I currently work with the Canadian military. I teach at the National Security Program and the Joint Command and Staff Program. And when I got on stage here, I looked across at the old National Defense Headquarters, and I had a flashback to a moment when I got a call from our Chief of Staff at the Canadian Forces College telling me that the CDS wants to meet with you and he is furious.
Yeah, I know.
So I went with trepidation. The union sent someone, and we were sitting at the ground floor there in front of the commissionaires. And my colleague, Professor Madsen, told me, "Don't worry, Walter, the CDS can't fire you, only the minister can." And we went up to the CDS's office, and a big smile came out. This was Jonathan Vance, shook my hands, and he said, "I hope you don't feel that I've called you here to reprimand you." I said, "Well, sir, the word furious was used." And he said, "That's funny how that works." And then he proceeded to give me a talk about why peacekeeping was important, because I had been quoted in the media saying there's no champion of peacekeeping at the senior levels of the Canadian government. And he wanted to prove me wrong. And as he was going through some of them, his points, I said, "Well, that's exactly what I teach in my class." And he said, "Well, you taught me well," because I had actually taught him some 20 years earlier in a war studies program. And then at the end, it was all smiles. And he said, "Walter, I still remember your class, and I remember getting an A. But I don't want you to blame me for Jonathan Vance and all the problems that he brought to the Canadian Armed Forces and endorsement to the Canadian government, please." Now, I was with another of my students, actually, Jenny Carignon. We had her speaking yesterday at Lord Elgin Hotel, just on the other side of that building. And it was a remarkable morning. And we had the interim director of CSIS, the director of the Communication Security Establishment, and the head of the CAF, the chief of defense staff, and they're all women. I thought it was that's really one sign of remarkable progress. But no talk of disarmament, not arms control, not peace operations, not the things that really make me inspired to work on these issues. It was all about interests, not values. It was about national interests and serving the nation, not serving humanity. And so I found myself saying, you know, I really wish I'd been over there with the CNANW into their meetings. That's when I could actually feel connected and doing something meaningful. So I really love this title of this workshop, and I really love being next to speaking on the panel with Peggy, talking about creative solutions, being solutions oriented, and having a vision. So constructing the future of UN peace operations. But of course, we can't do that without recognizing the problems. And very much like Cesar, you have to kind of bemoan where we are today. Internationally, there's been no new UN peacekeeping operations since 2015. The Haiti mission was closed in 2017 to great disaster. That if the UN mission had been in Haiti, I can certainly say that we wouldn't have seen the rise of gang violence. I walked the streets of Cité Soleil with the force commander. I saw how he took on the gangs. This is Carlos dos Santos Cruz, and how the UN had managed to create a stable peace there. But with the mission gone, it was war. And the same thing in Mali with the Colonel Goita having kicked out the UN from the Mali mission, and the Wagner group coming into ascendancy there, and the tremendous human rights without the international eyes and ears of the peacekeeping operation. There's all kinds of atrocities being committed there. Same thing in Central African Republic. When UN headquarters sent me to CAR, I saw in Bangui the president of CAR with his Wagner mercenaries as his close support protection. And I was shocked by that. And I saw actually a colleague of mine get beaten up by the Presidential Guard and the Wagner forces there. The UN mission deployments, now we had a high in 2015 of 104,000 peacekeepers. In fact, the UN Secretary General was in operational control of more forces on deployment than anybody else except the US president. Now the wars have changed that, of course, with the war in Russia and Ukraine. But now there's only 61,000. So we went from 104,000 down to 61,000. And originally I thought that was mostly Donald Trump, that we were bringing the numbers down because he wanted to reduce the peacekeeping budget from 8 billion down to 6 billion. The budget has stayed at 6 billion for the last 5 or 6 years, but the numbers have gone down. And I realized that there was something really concerning, and you almost remember the moment when you realize this is true, is that there was not to overstate it, but a betrayal from within. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is not a fan of peacekeeping. And I only discovered that over years of speaking with people who were close to him and with people in peacekeeping now. And he's the only Secretary General not to have created a new peacekeeping operation. So that's very tragic. He says good things about peacekeeping, but even when the U.S. wanted to put in a new UN mission into Haiti, the Secretary General and his Undersecretary General Lacroix were not in favor. And it was, of course, the main impediment was in the Security Council, where Russia and China didn't want to, well, they just wanted to play power politics with an issue that's very important for the U.S. because of the migration from Haiti. And it's a scar, it's an open wound in our hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere. And we would really like to see something done by that, done for that. And the United States actually wanted Canada to lead a mission, and Global Affairs Canada was working on the file extremely a lot to be able to see it, and the CAF did not want to touch it at all. In fact, the instruction, the advice to the minister from the chief of the armed forces was, let's exercise strategic patience. That was the term, meaning to do nothing while people are being killed, raped, murdered, and the gangs are on the ascendancy throughout Haiti. So really frustrating. When I look at the picture today, I see the East-West divide being there, and that part of the battle is actually in Africa. It's back to the Cold War with proxies in Africa and the Wagner forces being deployed there. And that's why we have to keep in that battle, keep a peacekeeping presence, because it's a presence of values and Western progressive ideas in the battle. And I hope that we can do more for Africa. And the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons has had a study to be completed, as far as I know. Right now, I testified earlier this year on Canada's role in Africa. The Security Council is playing a lot of political games, but they still are the most important forum where those great powers can talk. You can't imagine Putin and Biden getting together now or having talks, but it's in the Security Council, not in the council itself chamber, but there's a room nearby where they decide, okay, we're not going to play political games here. We're going to see what we can do constructively. And the peacekeepers in the field need their support. Think about those peacekeepers in Lebanon who are being bombed by Israel, who are being played by Hezbollah. And they are risking their lives, and they're not withdrawing in the face of a war that's going on in south of the Litani River in Lebanon. And they're the eyes and ears of the international community. And where they can, they do an important job in suppressing the fighting that's going on there. In fact, at one point in a previous Israeli invasion, the Nepalese held a bridge for 3 days because they just kept standing on there until the Israelis brought in the bulldozers and doing all the threats until they could actually forcibly remove the Nepalese. And by the way, Nepal is contributing 6,000 peacekeepers today as the #1 peacekeeper. I spend a lot of time working with Nepal now because I admire them so much for their contribution. So let's have a look a little bit what the future could be, because we're talking about constructing the future. And as activists, we should know what we want to be pushing forward. We should also think about what we envisaging a better world and being intellectual pioneers of certain ideas. So I see a huge need for peacekeeping in so many areas of the world. Almost every conflict is, for me, an obvious place for peacekeepers, whether it be in Sudan, where there once was the UN mission in Sudan, whether it be in Haiti, where even the US wants to be able to get a strong UN mission there, whether it be in Libya, which is one of the big problems that after the 2011 civil war, the international community, particularly the United States, decided, let's just leave the militias the way they are. And they would obviously start fighting. They would go after each other's throats. And we've had Libya in chaos since then, and a civil war continuing in different fashion. And so Libya needs a peacekeeping mission with a DDR mandate, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration mandate. Ukraine will need a peacekeeping force. When a peace agreement is eventually signed, after the parties get so exhausted from the fighting that they come to the negotiating table, they'll need somebody to help guarantee that agreement or monitor at least the line of contact, et cetera, and perhaps some transitional administration in certain territories. Gaza needs a peacekeeping operation. There were Canadian peacekeepers inside Gaza and along the border with Egypt from 1956 till 1967. That was Pearson's original peacekeeping force, the world's first UN peacekeeping force. And we had deployed Canadian soldiers there. And I think that's an example which we've pretty much forgotten about, but where you can actually have international forces in a very sensitive area of the world, where lots of cross-border attacking going on, but able to do a reasonable job and keep a lid on it until Nasser decided to kick the UN out, which was a big mistake for him. Another thing that I can see now is consolidation. Because the numbers are down, the headquarters, they haven't cut very much. They were talking about cutting 10% of the Department of Peace Operations, but you can do a lot of consolidation, which they're doing on doctrines, on like peacekeeping intelligence, protection of civilians, manuals on ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, lots of training, and technologies, how to better use UAVs for the monitoring roles of the peacekeepers. And especially in training, there's new technologies. What I've spent most of my time on these days is creating video games. But I don't have the avatars be warfighters, I have them be peacekeepers. And then how that's used, and the UN wants to use these simulations. I'll be starting next week a course on peace operations for the Joint Command and Staff Program, and they'll be playing those simulations, including with virtual reality options. The longer term, standby. We need the UN to be able to create its own standby. Canadian proposal for rapidly deployable military headquarters. We were also pioneering the Standby High Readiness Brigade, which was based in Denmark, but which was another fatality of Afghanistan when countries realized they can't double or triple hat, so they decided to just do the Afghan. We need to increase the standing police capacity that the UN has of police ready to be deployed based in Italy, and eventually go from standby to standing force, where soldiers, and I have some, my students, who would love to sign up for the UN. And that gets me to last area is Canada. Our numbers are at all-time low, unfortunately. Not since 1956 have we been so low. There are 21 military personnel on peacekeeping. Of that 21, there is one woman. We have Canada provides one woman military for peacekeeping today. And we are championing in our foreign policy, the ELSI initiative, which is to put more women and empower them in peacekeeping. We are largely using dollar diplomacy for peacekeeping and support. There's a peacekeeping ministerial coming up in Berlin in May of this year. And they're currently, GAC is looking around for what they can contribute. But there's so much hesitance, there's so much risk aversion that just giving money seems to be the way they do it. There is one positive element that Canada did innovate, and it's not been given credit, is we provide multi-mission support with a C-130, that's a Hercules aircraft, to different missions in Africa. And they go for 15 days every 3 months. And then they can move things around between missions and between Entebbe and the missions. We proposed and offered to the UN a quick reaction force. Quick reaction force. It was proposed in 2017. It hasn't been deployed yet. It's the slowest quick reaction force that I've ever heard of. We had 9 mission and force commanders in the 1990s of the UN missions, 9 of them. We've had none since the 1990s. So we have to get back into some leadership. And I think there's so many areas where you can do innovation in peacekeeping, because it's such a complex, fascinating area, and all these conflicts around the world where there's so many dynamics going on there that it really does call out for innovation, and crisis means an opportunity to innovate. And I don't think we should lose that opportunity. And finally, just my belief in this country, seeing the Chateau Laurier and the Houses of Parliament just nearby. We have a fantastic country. We really have to be grateful for being Canadians. We live in a multicultural society with a strong bilingual tradition, no colonial or great power baggage, a democratic country with fantastic people. And we should make that at the service of the world because that's a calling for the nation. That's something that can make Canada distinct. And peacekeeping is one of our distinct contributions to the world, and we are letting it down. Lester Pearson is metaphorically rolling in his grave. And even when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he said that we had to continue to develop this instrument of peace operations. And I truly believe that Canada has the basis, the people. I work with the soldiers in the Canadian Armed Forces, and some of them say have been trying for years to get on peace operations, but they can't. But I think that the capacity is there. So echoing some words that Peggy said, that I really think Canada can, if we stop being so risk averse and trepid, and actually stood up for our values as well as our interests. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Peggy and Walter, for those insightful presentations. I see a number of hands going up. Gentleman in the back, Adam, I think it is, first, then Robin, and then Richard, and then you, sir. Okay, we'll get those four.
Thank you very much to both panelists. So my question was for Walter. It's more of an opinion question. So I'm wondering, given that you explained the pretty aggressive downtick in Canadian contributions to peacekeeping, one thing that I've noticed in my research over the last 8 years is a much larger contribution by Canada in terms of actual troop deployment to NATO. So we doubled our deployment in Latvia. We expanded the program to train Ukrainian soldiers, also, I believe, in Latvia, might have been Estonia, but we've kind of put our eggs towards the basket of building NATO and military alliances. And so I'm wondering, with your experience, why have we shifted so far away from our peacekeeping ethos? That's one thing I've been trying to reconcile that I haven't been able to, and it comes back sometimes to Rwanda, but we're 30 years past that now. You'd think that we could have recovered from mistakes there. So I'm just interested to know what you think.
Yeah. I'm also wondering the same thing. In fact, I'm wondering about so much, I'm going to write a book about it. It's going to be called Who Killed Canadian Peacekeeping? And the suspects are the military, which has far greater favoritism towards NATO than to the UN, and it just complicates their life to have another organization like the UN. So they prefer to work within the NATO environment. But as I tell some of the students, if you actually want to go into a conflict zone, I mean, as a soldier, that's what some of their calling is, and make a positive difference, you don't do that through NATO. NATO is always waiting for war. But you go into the UN, you're going into actually war scenarios where you can make a positive difference. And for some of them, that resonates a lot. But the military is one suspect. The politicians are another. We had 3 elections with a promise to re-engage. And then we go to the all-time low. Justin Trudeau has provided half the number of peacekeepers on a monthly average as Stephen Harper did. Half the number. And so I just, the promises ring so empty now on the peacekeeping file. The UN is also partly to blame. They haven't created new missions, and so the total number is going down. And I've asked every CDS for the last 20 years why we aren't doing more for the UN and defense ministers when I can. And the first one, Ray Hanaud, told me, well, the allies aren't doing it, so we don't need to do it. So it's back to the NATO, these are our allies, these are people with. And so there was a general trend to move towards the global south providing peacekeepers and not the north. But the UN would love to be able to get equality between the north and the south, but that's not possible. So the allies are another suspect. And I have a few others, including individuals, but I'll wait for the book to come out when we look at that.
Thanks.
And I just
Peggy,
like
yeah.
to add a quick point on the risk averse part, which I think was really played up and really made, cabinet ministers nervous. But again, and so far as I was able to tell, the global affairs did not go to bat in the way that they should have. But the other aspect I wanted to mention about risk averse is that the casualties, I mean, take the Mali mission in particular, which has the which had the highest number of peacekeepers killed of any peacekeeping mission. They're not Western, and the Mali mission has had a fair number of German, Dutch, Norwegian peacekeepers, a fair number of very capable Western peacekeepers from Western countries, and they weren't suffering the casualties. The best equipped and the best trained troops were not, which of course makes the argument even stronger that the best equipped and the most well-trained, the most privileged military forces should be engaging. I mean, it's a disgrace, in other words, to use that argument.
Okay,
It's too dangerous.
Robin, I think you were next on my list.
Thank you for your presentations. I'm going to take the bait from Peggy there. And but first, Walter, I noted you also mentioned possibility of peacekeepers in Israel-Gaza conflict. And thanks for the nod to a standing capability at the UN, the UNEPS, the Emergency Peace Service. But the question was, what are the options for Gaza and Israel, given how difficult this is, and how do you get consent of the parties to get the capacity in?
I think Peggy will have a better answer than myself because she's talked about the transitional administration for Palestine, UNTAP. But my point is that Israel doesn't have the end game right now because they just want to do the whacking and get at Hamas and Hezbollah. And yet they need to have an end game. And the United States realizes that Israel doesn't have an end game. In fact, that was words between Biden and Netanyahu. So that when it comes to the end game, what other end game would there be except stability forces, impartial stability forces? Israel doesn't want to occupy for the long term. You can't allow a non-democratic process, Gazan force to be there because of a threat to Israel. So you need to be able to have some sort of peacekeeping force that provides stability and helps rebuild Gaza. There's going to be a tremendous rebuilding capacity. And for that, you need a massive investment with massive structure, which I think will lead right into the UNTAP idea.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, jumping first to the consent question, I mean, that really is, why would Israel agree? I mean, I agree with your comments about they don't, well, I'll put it another way. Israel has made it absolutely clear, including at the UN, that its end game is is greater Israel. So their end game, I mean, it's not a secret. I mean, the map, Netanyahu held up the map entitled Greater Israel at the UN at the last General Assembly, didn't put the map up this time, but repeated it. They've passed a resolution in the Knesset condemning and disavowing a two-state solution because the solution is the occupation of Greater Israel. So in terms of consent, because what I'm proposing a UN transitional administration in Palestine, not just in Gaza, because how could you have a UN mission providing security, not just for Israel against attack by Palestinian fighters, but Palestinians? So you're going to have an international mission with a robust military force protecting Gaza while the rampaging against, while the increased illegal occupation and annexation of the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory goes on. So it becomes untenable to be protecting this one part and getting it ready for negotiations for a viable two-state solution while the vast majority of the area is being, further occupied. So the proposal that I'm putting forward is a UN transitional administration for Palestine, for all of the occupied territory declared, noted by the International Court of Justice in its recent advisory opinion, you know, the entirety of the occupied Palestinian territory, that is Palestine. In the final status negotiations, I mean, if we get to those, there could potentially be land swaps. This has been discussed before. So you can have a corridor from Gaza connecting it to the rest of the West Bank. And that in return for that, Israel would get some of the currently illegal occupied territory. I mean, they could negotiate that, but otherwise, the viable two-state solution is the 1967 borders. So to step back a bit, though, the sort of ultimate mechanism, perhaps you can put it that way, of UN peace operations is when the state of the country or the society or the part of a country that they're trying to help is in such disarray that they lack the capacity not only for security, but for basic governance functions. And there have been a number of times, and I would say the most successful example was the UN Transitional Administration in East Timor, which helped bring what had been an illegally occupied territory, illegally occupied by Indonesia, East Timor, into shepherded it through to the independent country of Timor-Leste. So in a UN Transitional Administration, the UN actually exercises governance functions. At the same time, it builds local capacity to take over. And the idea is to put yourself out of business because you're training the local people to take over. So just to end on the point of what it is, a UN Transitional Administration for Palestine would have a mandate to provide interim governance and security throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, while building local capacity for self-governance in preparation for free and fair elections, which UNTAP would then organize and carry out. And of course, it would have to be supported by a very robust, very operational, diverse military force. Okay, I'll stop there because I've gone on and on, but the consent issue, that issue, Israel is not going to consent to this until it has no other option but to consent to this.
Okay, we're running out of time here, so I'm going to take the next three questions in a row, and we'll give our panelists a chance to respond to them. I have Richard Denton. Sorry. Okay, then I have the gentleman here, and I had Doug Roach as asking for it. I'm going to have to cut it off at that point. So please go ahead.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentations. My name is Faramars. I'm working with SIPS. While we are talking about UN, we should know that there are two kinds of UN. While we are talking about UN during the era of after Cold War until 2001, and also from 2010 to the present time. There are two types of UN. In the after the Cold War, it was a meaning crisis among the major powers. So UN was functional in Bosnia, Herzegovina, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Kuwait, and somewhere else. And after 2010, when Arab Spring started, and then Ukraine, then Gaza, and also returning of Taliban to Afghanistan, we are talking about the different UN as an international institution. So if you see to Gaza and in Afghanistan, more than 1.4 million girls are not allowed to go to school, to higher education. More than 5 million women, they are not allowed to go to their job, to their office. Even Taliban, they issued a letter to the UN office in Kabul that you are not allowed to hire women in your office. We are talking about a UN which has no function. If you ask from a girl in Afghanistan, what does it mean? What does UN mean? She will say it's united for nothing, not United Nations. Because the things that is happening in Gaza, in Afghanistan, in other parts of the world, we should redefine the UN's function. And also we should say that the role of UN at this contemporary international relations has been changed. So my question is that how can the academic seminars or the universities help UN to redefine its function or reorganized its structure to be meaningful, useful, and functional in the international relations at this era? Thank you.
Okay, a very simple question indeed. Doug Roach will have our final question, and then we'll have the panelists respond as they wish.
Thank you, Walter. You identified Sudan and Libya, among other war-torn zones where there should be UN peacekeeping. Is there a core reason, can you identify a core reason why UN peacekeeping has fallen off? I mean, is it the veto system in the Security Council? Is it lack of political and moral will? Is it lack of leadership by the Secretary General? Is there a reason you can really pinpoint?
Okay, please.
Right. Thank you, Doug. In Sudan and Libya's case, the problem is with the conflicting parties. The problem is with the conflicting parties. So in Libya, the militias don't want a peacekeeping force because they would lose some of their authority if they had to surrender their weapons and help create a new Libyan military. And similarly, the two generals in Sudan are still looking for military victory, and they're not looking for a mission that would help create peace between them. So in those two cases, it's the conflicting parties. But behind that are powers that aren't putting enough influence in order to force them to the negotiating table. And so the great power politics still plays in all this. And then there's the Russians who are using this as opportunities for building connections into Africa and sometimes playing both sides of the street in order to get more power for Russian national, very selfish interest. But the UN could still play a role in mediation. You know, they still have representatives there, special representatives who are there to help with the mediate between the parties. But it helps a lot more when your special representative actually has boots on the ground that can actually make a difference in the implementation and show it. So I would like to see in both those cases an observer mission, even in times of war, have the eyes and the ears there to be able to keep an eye on what's going on, similar to what UNIFIL is doing in Lebanon. Which gets me back to UNAMA, the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. It's the only game in town now. After NATO countries had invested over $1 trillion in Afghanistan and generations of Western soldiers had rotated into Afghanistan, what do we have to show for a NATO presence? It's completely gone, and it's abandoned the women there. The UN didn't abandon them. It's very constrained by the government of Afghanistan, by the Taliban, but it is an important element. It's the voice where you can tell the Taliban right and wrong, where you can try and work with the little bit of room that you have. So I'd say if the glass is 2% full, we can make it 4% full. So we can look at ways of increasing UNAMA, but don't dismiss it outright, because you might even lose the 2%, and then the potential for expanding to a 20% in the future would be gone. UNAMA should have became a peacekeeping force. I was proposing that as early as 2006, UNAMA 2. And then it would actually have been able to do a lot of functions, including mediation with the Taliban. Back when you were called a traitor, I was in one military room and said, you are now the enemy of everyone in this room for having talked about negotiations with the Taliban. And in the end, the Trump administration did terrible negotiations with the Taliban. And we should have done that 10 years earlier. So it's UNAMA is a really important mission. And despite its being constrained, it's still something that we can build on and something that can be there for the future. And even after NATO wants to forget about Afghanistan, the UN still works on it, and it works with the agencies there, UNICEF, et cetera, that are doing some excellent work.
And I would just add to that, I mean, the perennial problem of the UN. I mean, the UN is a vast organization. There's a UN Secretariat, but then there's all of the other bodies, the humanitarian, the development, the economic, the climate. I mean, I would say what you were really describing were problems with the UN Security Council and problems with great powers in deciding. And in this case, Afghanistan, it was the US that was leading on the strategy and very deliberately sidelined the UN mission. So, I mean, I think it's incredibly important in trying to, and of course, I agree with everything that Walter said with respect to UNAMA and the difference it would have made. I mean, we could have had a negotiation with including the Taliban where they might have ended up as part of the government. They do represent a significant part of the country, and not the entirety of the government, which is what we have now.
Okay, and I would just note on, the point about academic institutions and what they can do. I think we could all merit in universities in this country and elsewhere of actually studying the UN system in all its dimensions. I think we tend to get eclipsed by the conflictual elements from the Security Council. There's a lot of very important work that gets done by specialized agencies that rarely gets the media attention that I think it merits, but it would all help us to have a better understanding. And if there are, individuals like to pursue this, I would just recall there is a body, the Academic Council for UN Studies, that exists, and individual scholars as well as institutions and centers can affiliate, and they have an active program, annual meetings, speakers, etc. So with this, I'd like you to join me in thanking our two presenters,